her to continue. She ticked off the items: a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and health insurance. She watched his eyes to make sure he was paying attention and understood the implications of each demand. She braced for his response, knowing that he often chose political expediency over idealism and was capable of callousness, even cruelty. The scope of her list was breathtaking. She was proposing a fundamental and radical restructuring of American society with enactment of historic social welfare and labor laws. To succeed, she would have to overcome opposition from the courts, business, labor unions, and conservatives. Nothing like this had ever been done in the United States before, she said. You know that, don't you? The man sat across from her in his wheelchair amid the clutter of boxes and rumpled rugs. Soon he would head to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. He would inherit the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. An era of rampant speculation had come to an end. The stock market had collapsed, rendering investments valueless. Banks were shutting down, stripping people of their lifetime savings. And about 1/3 of workers were unemployed. Wages were falling, tens of thousands were homeless. Real estate prices had plummeted, and millions of homeowners faced foreclosure. His choice of labor secretary would be one of his most important early decisions. His nominee must understand economic and unemployment issues, but be equally effective as a coalition builder. He was a handsome man with aquiline features, and he studied the plain, matronly woman sitting before him. No one was more qualified for the job. She knew as much about labor law and administration as anyone in the country. He'd known her for more than 20 years, the last 4 in Albany, where she had worked at his side. He trusted her and knew she would never betray him. But placing a woman in the labor secretary's job would expose him to criticism and ridicule. Her list of proposals would stir heated opposition even among his loyal supporters. The 8-hour day was a standard plank of the Socialist Party. Unemployment insurance seemed laughably improbable, and direct aid to the unemployed would threaten his campaign pledge of a balanced budget. He said he would back her. And thus began Frances Perkins' role as the Secretary of Labor and the first female cabinet member, a role she held for over 12 years, the entire presidency of FDR. And I should note that I just did the reading from the book I read for this sermon. It's The Woman Behind the New Deal, The Life of Frances Perkins, FDR's Secretary of Labor and His Moral Conscience by Kristen Downey. So why really should we care about Frances Perkins? It's Labor Day weekend, it seems like an appropriate thing, but really why? I mean, think of the list I just read you. The 40-hour work week, minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a ban on child labor, Social Security, public employment agency, and worker safety regulations are all things that we are so comfortable with. No one debates whether we should have them. We might debate how far they extend or how we should fund them, but nobody today is even debating whether we should have them. So we take them for granted, and we all have Frances Perkins to thank for that. I want to tell you a few interesting facts about her life and on the characteristics that, in my opinion, made her so extraordinary. Her early life. She was born Fannie Coralie Perkins in 1880, and then she later changed the name to Frances when she became Episcopalian, so that kind of signals how important that was in her life, that she changed religions. She grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and her parents were staunch Congregationalists, which back then meant Calvinists, so very fundamentalist, very theology about the selected are going to go to heaven, and you will know you're selected if you're wealthy, essentially is how that worked. They were middle-class merchants, but with very much upper-class aspirations. They were social climbers. In her family were some very prominent ancestors that originally had arrived in this country in 1680, so 200 years before. One was James Otis, who I'd never heard of, but he's the guy that came up with the term taxation without representation in the Revolutionary War, for which he resoundingly got clubbed in the head by the British, and according to the book was never quite right after that. And then there was General Oliver Otis Howard, I think was her uncle, and he was the founder of Howard University in Washington, D.C., and resoundingly ridiculed by Southerners of why you would create a university for African Americans was beyond them. Her education was quite impressive, especially for a woman at the turn of the 20th century. In 1902, she graduated from Mount Holyoke College with a Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry and Physics. And then in 1910, 8 years later, she had a Master's in Political Science from Columbia University. And then while she was doing all these jobs and having quite a career that I'm going to talk about in a second, she did a variety of study, and in 1918 had finished the study. It didn't come into a degree, but study in economics and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School. So not a small, easy school to get through. Her first job, she was in the Midwest for a few years. She was a teacher in Lake Forest, Illinois. So if you know anything about Lake Forest, beyond that it's an oasis over the interstate when you're going to Chicago, it's one of the wealthiest communities in the country, and it was one of the wealthiest back then. And so she was teaching the children of some of the wealthiest capitalists in the country, but on the weekends she would volunteer at the settlement houses in Chicago, particularly Hull House. If you know anything about Hull House, it's on the near west side. It was run by Jane Addams, who, I don't know that she ever formally joined a Unitarian church, but the Unitarians claim her, because she always went to one. So very Unitarian friendly at the time. So she had this juxtaposition in her life and seemed to have no problem with that, with becoming very friendly with super wealthy families, but then being very friendly with the immigrants that were coming to America at the time and feeding into the factories like the shirtwaist factory we heard about. So her career takes off in 1910. She's the head of the New York Consumers League, so that's New York City, the New York Consumers League, and she lobbied for better work hours and working conditions. So she was already beginning to do that at the time that the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire broke out in 1911. And then she became the executive secretary for the Committee on Safety of the City of New York. Then in 1929, after gaining respect throughout the state as a labor leader, she was appointed the first Commissioner of the New York State Department of Labor by the Governor, Franklin Roosevelt. And then this culminated in 1933 with the interview that got her the Secretary of Labor position and enabled her to deliver on all of her objectives except one, universal health care. And we know how hard that one is. So there's a few characteristics about Frances that I really want to talk about, because I think it has a lot to do with why she was so successful. I mean, as a woman in that environment back then in the Depression, I mean, I think everything would have been stacked against her. But she was very opportunistic. She could read the political landscape and preempt her rivals. And there's repeated stories in the book, and the book is actually quite long. It goes over years of once, over and over again, especially once she was part of the cabinet, she would know that something was afoot, and she'd get to the president and, get in his ear about what he should do before the guy could come into his office and give his case. So the president usually sided with her. She was very clever in that way. She was very well connected and respected by those with power and money. The author talks about that people just wanted to help her, and sometimes it made no sense because these were the most affluent in our country. Why should they be helping her with labor laws and the people that they technically should be against? She was very, very patient. She could wait everybody out, and then she was very relentless when she needed to strike. So she would wait for the right opportunity, like I said before, and if she didn't get her way, she would sit back and then come up with another approach. And the best example was when all of her legislation was getting passed and the Social Security Office was created. For political reasons, they didn't put it under the Secretary of Labor, they put it under the Secretary of Commerce. And the first appointee was a complete political appointee by Franklin Roosevelt. He owed somebody a favor. He was just a rich playboy that had no experience whatsoever, and within 6 to 9 months, he just completely imploded. And she just did this slow burn watching all this happen, and once he pretty much left, she stepped in and rescued the day and got the Social Security Department working. She was very much a both and instead of an either or in the way she approached things. And by that I mean she could, in some, a lot of politicians or a lot of people can become self-righteous, and then they're not going to deal with people unless they agree with them completely in all the things they believe in, and then we'll talk. Well, she wasn't that way. She realized that the people in power at the time, she needed them, and so she needed to either look the other way or figure out a way how to navigate that. Tammany Hall is probably the best example. For those of you that aren't familiar, Tammany Hall was a political organization in New York City from the mid-19th century to about the mid-20th century. It was a Democratic Party machine, and it really was designed to help immigrants that were coming into New York City get well established, and in favor they would want their vote from them. So it worked really well for the Democratic Party, but it was corrupt, as you could imagine. And so she had to go to the politicians from Tammany Hall and get her social reform. So often she had, and it was all run by men who were very sexist, very misogynistic. Everything you might imagine was what that was about. But she put up with it, and I remember there was a description about her sitting in a meeting, and she had to play the demure woman that didn't say anything until they all finally stopped talking, and then she just kind of dropped this bombshell and then got her way. So it's just very, very interesting. She was definitely lived like she was part of the top 1%, yet she worked on labor reform. So once again, that both and kind of thing. And the one thing that's really interesting to me was she was bisexual. She was married to the New York economist Paul Caldwell Wilson, and they had one daughter together, Susanna, who became a New York socialite. And she would go back to New York almost every weekend and be with him. Now, he had some medical problems and ended up not being able to work most of his life. But clearly, she stayed with him and by all accounts very much loved him. But yet, and you've probably heard of these rumors, there were strong rumors that she had intimate relationships with Eleanor Roosevelt, particularly when they were in Albany in the governor's mansion. And then a series of wealthy women whom she lived with and entertained with in Washington, D.C., and they pretty much acted like a married couple. So very much a world that I don't know that exists today, but it was very comfortable back then. And then finally, her religious and spiritual grounding, I think, is what really helped her through all of this and helped her when times were tough. So some of the things, so there's a description that once she turned Episcopalian, she just really embraced it, and the Episcopalian churches that she went to embraced the social gospel movement, which I will talk about in a second. But it's said that in Washington, D.C., she would get up very early, and every morning she would be at matins at her church, and then go into her office in D.C., and then she was there every Sunday. She wasn't an evangelist where she really talked about her religion much, but I believe that she felt that she needed to act her religion. And so very much a religious person and very spiritually grounded. So I mentioned her husband. He was severely bipolar after he was a lawyer in New York, and he had worked for the government, had a great job and a great career, and then had a breakdown and was hospitalized numerous times and never really recovered. So ended up staying in New York, raising their daughter during the weekdays. And so Frances Perkins became the sole breadwinner. There was dealing with the deep hardship of the Great Depression. She was often on the campaign trail and had to see all the hardship that was going on everywhere and face it firsthand. Labor unions. She very much believed in labor unions and thought that they were going to be the salvation of the labor movement. And then she was very sad to see that the same political infighting and corruption occurred in the labor unions, and watched them self-destruct by the end of her term. She faced relentless criticism, probably mostly because she was a woman, but she submitted her resignation several times to FDR, and he never would accept it. And so she just had to deal with the press that was just relentless with her, and as you might expect, often talked about how homely she looked and what she wore and all that kind of stuff that is just pathetic. When we got to World War II, the Labor Department also handled immigration. And so she pulled many strings to get as many Jews, socialists, and labor supporters out of Europe. She's even credited for bringing the von Trapp family to the US, as well as Sigmund Freud. She saved the International Labor Organization. She relocated it from Switzerland to Quebec because the Nazis were not interested in the International Labor Organization, and they needed to get it out of Europe. And then really was troubling. She stayed on after FDR died into the first, I think, 6 months of the Truman administration, and was there when the cabinet learned that they were going to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. And so that was another struggle for her religiously that she had to live through. So about her religion. I mentioned it a second ago, the social gospel movement. What was that all about? So in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a social gospel movement, primarily in the Protestant movement of the United States. And it was a belief that the Christian gospel called on society to emulate the good works of Jesus. It wasn't just enough to believe in Jesus, but you had to emulate the good works of Jesus. And it was surrounding part of the Lord's Prayer. And those of you that may not have a Christian background, there's a phrase in the Lord's Prayer that's said in almost every Christian service, and it's, "Thy kingdom come." And they took that as their mantra, that they believed that the second coming of Christ would only occur after humans had proved that they were worthy. And they were only going to prove that they were worthy if we had solved all of the social ills that were coming up in the rapid industrialization of society. And once that those were solved, then the second coming of Christ would happen. So it was a very interesting theology that spawned a whole movement, particularly amongst the Protestants. So today, I would say that our Unitarian Universalist movement is one of the current manifestations of the social gospel movement from that period. But we believe that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. We believe that humankind can and will evolve towards a more loving and harmonious place, both with each other and with our universe, with which, of course, humanity is completely integrated and accountable. We believe not necessarily in the second coming of Christ, but in a new millennium. Like the social gospelers, we believe we are accountable to move society ever so slowly towards this utopia. We don't believe necessarily in a divine intervention will do it for us. We need to take the reins and do it ourselves. And then as a movement, we continually then search for that path that leads us there. We search for truth and hope and possibility for us and the generations that will inhabit this universe in the future. So, where did I put that? So as I was working on this sermon, I had already picked out the hymn, Spirit of Life, and it dawned on me how much the Spirit of Life, the lyrics, kind of spoke to what my point was in this sermon. So let me kind of walk you through this, kind of line by line. The Spirit of Life come unto me. To me, that's a calling forth of the divine, the essence of what gives life meaning, of the utopian vision, of the unbounded and infinite potential of life. For Frances, it was the social gospel, a God that had her back as she moved to emulate the radical vision of Jesus on earth. For Unitarian Universalists, it's the spirit of the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, the hope for a new millennia embedded with love and harmony and potential. So then the phrase, sing in my heart all the stirring of compassion. Compassion is the cornerstone to building a better world. There's many expressions of compassion that we have here. Paying attention to the marginalized, paying attention to the women and children of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, paying attention to the over 10 million undocumented workers trying to eke out a better existence for themselves and their families who are powerless and often exploited, paying attention to those imprisoned by human traffickers, paying attention to our acceptance of the systemic oppression of people of color in our society for over 400 years, paying attention to the unfettered exploitation of our planet, which will impact the potential for billions in the near and distant future. These, to me, are the stirrings of compassion we're singing about. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Acknowledge that justice work is fluid and hard because society is ever-changing. The forces for justice and oppression are constantly changing as the wind and the tides change. Like Francis Perkins, we need to be opportunistic. We need to be patient yet relentless. We need to accept that nothing is ever black and white, completely either or. To accomplish our vision, we need the ability to hold competing ideas within ourselves simultaneously. We need to think both and. We need to accept that any movement towards justice is still bending the arc, except that we may not see many of the results in our lifetime like Perkins did. The journey may be the ultimate meaning in our lives. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Frances clung to her liberal social gospel belief and never wavered from her faith in the spirit of the Apostle Paul's words in his letter to the church in Corinth that I read earlier. Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Similarly, we cling to the words of the famous Unitarian minister, Reverend Theodore Parker. I quote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." Our faith is grounded in this belief, which then sets us free to act in good faith. We have a noble purpose, justified by a noble vision of what can be. So I'm going to close in song. I'm going to do it this way, a little experiment. I'm going to sing The Spirit of Life by myself, and I'd like you to focus on the words and the meaning that we just discussed. And then if you feel so moved, you can join me the second time we get through it. Does that sound like a good plan? Let me get a drink of water. So focus on the words. Spirit of life, come unto me, sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. Please join me. Spirit